to 80 years ago, I took $114.75, every penny I'd saved, and I bought 3 shares of City Service Preferred.
When a country has a lot of debt that keeps getting bigger, it can cause some problems. It can make the country's economy grow slower, make it harder for businesses to invest, and limit the government's ability to help in unexpected situations. It also makes it more likely that there could be a sudden money problem, where people might lose trust in the country. But the most successful investor in the history of America, Warren Buffett, plans to end all this. So, in this video, we're going to discuss how Warren Buffett plans to end America's long-term debt in just 5 minutes. The $32 trillion debt. This number got bigger much faster than experts thought it would because of the pandemic and how the country had to spend a lot to help with it. Both the Republicans and the Democrats, which are 2 groups of people who make decisions for the country, are worried about this big number. But they haven't made big plans yet to fix the main things that make this number go up, like spending money on Social Security and Medicare. They did agree on something recently to try and slow down how much money they spend. This might help a bit, but the big number is still going to get even bigger, maybe even reaching $50 trillion in a few years. Right now, important discussions are happening in the government about how to use money. Some people want to spend less than what the president and others agreed on. If they can't figure this out by next year, it might cause a temporary stop in some government activities, which is called a shutdown. And if they don't agree on the spending plans by the end of the year, there will be an automatic 1% cut in some parts. Also, some people are talking about changing the rules for how much money people and businesses have to give to the government and taxes. They want to make it so that some groups pay less, especially if they're investing in certain things. But experts say this could cost a lot of money, either $80 billion over 10 years or $1.1 trillion if the changes become permanent. Imagine there's a really big piggy bank that keeps getting fuller and fuller. Now it's at $32 trillion. Some smart people are saying it's time for the leaders in Congress to work together to figure out why the piggy bank keeps getting so big. They think it's because the US government is spending a lot on important things and not getting enough money back. The person in charge of the country's money, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, talked about this with some other important people. She said that they're working on a plan to make the piggy bank smaller, and they even have some ideas to lower how much people have to pay in interest. The 3 major drivers of the U.S.'s growing national debt. Number 1, demographics. People are living longer, which is really good news, but it also means they need to plan for having enough money for a longer retirement. The first group of baby boomers turned 65 in 2011, and by 2050, there will be about 24 million more people over 65. But the number of younger people between 20 and 64 years old will only go up by 18 million during the same time.
Are you worried about Congress playing politics with the raising of the debt ceiling? What would this do to Berkshire Hathaway stock and to the overall economy?
You mean if they didn't raise it?
If they didn't raise it.
Yeah,
Right.
well, it would probably be the most asinine, act that Congress which has ever performed. At one time in Indiana, back in the 1890s, I think they passed a bill. I know it was introduced. You can look it up on a search engine.
It's really good news that people in America are living longer. And it's no surprise that the big group of baby boomers is retiring. But because more people are getting older and not working, the government needs to spend more money to help them. They have programs like Social Security and health programs that take care of older people. These programs are important, but they are using a lot of the government's money. Because of these changes, it's putting a lot of pressure on how the government spends its money. This might make it harder to keep all the important programs running smoothly for older and vulnerable people. Number 2, the rising cost of health care. Taking care of our health is super important for our country's money and future. It's a really big part of our whole economy, and it's growing fast. We spend a lot of money on healthcare, more than any other country, but we don't always get the best results. Even though we spend so much, our health doesn't always turn out better than in other countries. If we make our healthcare system work better, it will not only make our lives better, but it will also help our country's money and future be more stable and secure. Number 3, inadequate revenue. Imagine if you had made a promise to do lots of things, but the money you have isn't enough to cover all those promises. That's a bit like what's happening with the government. They're saying they'll do a lot of things for people, but the money they get from taxes isn't always enough. Also, the way they collect taxes is complicated and can be confusing. It's not very efficient or fair. They have rules that give special benefits to certain activities or groups of people. These rules, called tax breaks, actually make the money the government owes even bigger. And sometimes they can even make the economy work in strange ways that aren't good for everyone. Let's clear up 5 misunderstandings about the country's high debt. Number 1, the U.S. has a debt of $32 trillion to settle. The U.S. has a big pile of money it owes, but it's not like regular bills. It's money the country borrowed a long time ago, and now it needs to pay some of it back. This is normal for countries, and even a big country like Great Britain still owes money from a really long time ago. Last year, the U.S. had to use about $395 billion to take care of its debt. That might sound like a lot, but it's just a small part of all the money the country makes. It's like using a tiny bit of your allowance. But some smart people think that in the future, it might cost even more to take care of this debt. They say it might be around $663 billion this year. Plus, there's a lot of old debt that's coming due soon, like when a game you borrowed has to be returned. This could be a big deal because it's a lot of money compared to everything the country makes in a year. 2. The U.S.'s current debt is way too high. Think of the debt as how much money you owe compared to how much money you make. Last year, for the U.S., this ratio was about 97%, which is less than 100%. So it's not as bad as it might seem. A really smart economist named Mark Zandi says that just saying the huge number of $32 trillion doesn't tell the whole story. What matters is how much money the country makes. That's like their allowance to take care of the debt. So even though the debt number is big, there are also really big resources to help manage it. 3. Debt isn't good for the U.S. economy. Sometimes the government needs to borrow money to do really important things. This helps them do things like protect the environment and build new things like roads and bridges. It's like when you save money for something special, but on a much bigger scale. So when the government borrows money, it's like taking out a loan for a good reason. It helps them make our country better in the long run. 4. The U.S. should work on paying down the debt promptly to avoid any future crisis. Right now, the U.S. doesn't have to worry too much about a debt problem that causes a big crisis. But if we keep spending money too quickly, there might be a problem in the future. They can make sure everything is okay by being careful about how much we spend compared to how much money we make, and also by trying to make the economy grow even more. Some people even think we're growing so fast right now that a crisis is unlikely to happen soon. They predict that we'll have really good economic growth. 5. The U.S.'s debt issue is kind of unique. Many countries around the world are dealing with a lot of money they owe, just like how sometimes you might have to pay back money you borrowed for something important. Right now, countries like China and some places in the Middle East are having a hard time with the money they owe. Experts think that in the future, more and more countries might have this same kind of problem with the money they owe. Unless policymakers make some changes, it could cause some issues later on. Warren Buffett's plan to end the U.S. debt in 5 minutes. Warren Buffett once talked on TV about an idea. He said that if the country's money situation isn't good, maybe the people in charge shouldn't be allowed to stay in their jobs. But he was just talking, and it wasn't a real plan or rule. A while back in July 2011, there was a big discussion among the people in charge about how to make sure the government had enough money to keep going. They had to figure it out before a special date in August, or else the government might stop working for a bit. The people in Congress were having private meetings to find a solution, and different news sources were talking about what might happen. Buffett talked on TV a while ago, on July 7th, 2011. He said something like a joke, but also a little bit serious. He said, if the government spends too much money, maybe the people in charge shouldn't be allowed to keep their jobs. After that, some emails went around with his words. They also talked about a made-up rule called the Congressional Reform Act of 2013 that people said should be a new rule for the government. There was a set of rules that some people thought would be a good idea for the government. They said important things like how long someone can work for the government and how they get paid. These rules started spreading around the internet around 2009 and got more popular over time. Some people even said that the really rich guy, Warren Buffett, talked about them, but that part wasn't true. It's important to know that these rules were never actually suggested by anyone in charge of the country, and they didn't become real laws. So even though people talked about them a lot, they were just ideas, not actual rules for the government. But did you see any solution from Buffett's opinion on solving U.S. debt issues? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments section. And thanks for watching.